Olá a todos, obrigado pelo vosso interesse neste pequeno vídeo, conversa com o professor Richard Ebeling, um famoso pensador liberal, libertário, se quiserem, um homem que tem escrito e pensado o liberalismo desde há décadas. O professor Richard Ebeling é Distinguished Professor de Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership no Colégio Militar da Carolina do Sul. É uma das principais figuras académicas da Escola Austríaca de Economia e do liberalismo clássico nos dias de hoje. Foi presidente da Foundation for Economic Education e da Society for the Development of Austrian Economics. Ao longo da sua carreira, colaborou, entre outros, com o American Institute for Economic Research, com o Mises Institute, com a Future of Freedom Foundation e com o Liberty Fund, com quem publicou 3 volumes com escritos inéditos de Ludwig von Mises. Escritos estes que se encontravam, aliás, retidos na União Soviética após terem sido confiscados pelas autoridades nazis em Viena. Em 2019, o professor Richard Ebeling publicou um novo livro, o qual recomendamos vivamente, com o título For a New Liberalism. E é precisamente sobre liberalismo, o que é o neoliberalismo, que novo liberalismo é este, que vamos hoje falar.
So, welcome, Professor Ebeling. Thank you for accepting our request. We are very pleased to have you for this conversation. So, without further ado, our first question perhaps would be, what would you say is the origin of the term neoliberalism? Everybody nowadays is talking about neoliberalism. There is a sort of world conspiracy of neoliberalism. What is the origin of this term, and what did it stand for before all this maybe modern mania?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's not an easy one to answer. One finds references already in the 1910s, and certainly the 1920s. Some author here or there will refer to a new or a neoliberalism. On the one hand, there were the opponents of laissez-faire liberalism, that is, the limited government free market liberalism that was very predominant in the 19th century. And they were advocates of what they called a new liberalism or a social liberalism, far more government interventionism, far more government welfare redistribution. Even if it was not being policy implemented, they viewed that this needed to be the new 20th century version of liberalism. But then with the coming of the Great Depression and the challenge to democracy and any form of a limited government free enterprise, private property, social order by the fascists and the communists, and then with the rise of Hitler in Germany, the National Socialists or the Nazis. Friends of liberalism, that is, those who were the intellectual descendants of 19th century liberalism, a liberalism that believed in individual liberty based upon individual rights to life, liberty, and honestly acquired property, that believed that markets should be basically open and free, and that its complement was freedom of trade universally. And many of the liberals in that earlier 19th century setting also believed in freedom of movement. That is, they were the great advocates of elimination of passports and migration barriers as well. Their intellectual heirs, in one form or another in the 1920s and the 1930s, felt greatly challenged by the rise of these various forms of totalitarian collectivism, and that the future did not bode well for human freedom and democratic government. So they began writing on these things. One particular point of this was in the mid-1930s. Around 1937, a book was published by a very well-known American journalist at that time named Walter Lookman. And he published a book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Good Society, obviously a playoff on Adam Smith's book. Now, the first part of the book, in my opinion, is an insightful, lucid, very well-written critique of all forms of collectivist totalitarianism, and basing his economic arguments against it consciously in terms of the footnote references to the criticisms that were being made at that time against socialist central planning by the Austrian economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich A. Hayek. And like I said, the first half of the book is a brilliant refutation and challenge against all forms of totalitarian collectivism. But the second part of the book is called The Reconstruction of Liberalism. And by which Lookman meant is that a new liberalism has to be alive and vibrant and a response to these collectivist challenges. And that the laissez-faire liberalism had to be put aside. You still would have private property, competitive markets, a wide degree of personal freedom and civil liberties, without which the idea of a free society has no meaning. A good society would have no meaning. But it would be a society that would have to have a greater degree of government intervention, regulation, and wealth redistribution than the 19th century liberals had advocated or had been willing to even give credence to. Now, inspired by this book, a conference occurred in Paris, France in August of 1938, bringing together classical liberals from England, France, Spain, Switzerland, the United States, exiles from Germany, Austria, and Poland, for instance. And it became, when the transcript of the proceedings was published later in 1938, it was called the Walter Lippmann Colloquium. And these scholars, all of whom were dedicated to market competition, market-based pricing as a guide for production and coordination of the market, tried to deal with the challenges of this from various sociological, political, economic, and social perspectives. But then at the end, sort of like a closing session of this, they said, well, if we're going to try to reconstruct a new liberalism, there were some 19th century laissez-faire liberals there. The most outspoken one in the discussions that you see in this transcript of the proceedings was Ludwig von Mises. But the upshot was that most of them said is that we must preserve the core institutions of the market economy, but must realize that there have to be degrees of government regulation and redistribution of wealth. A very modest and moderate welfare state for the least able to support themselves, and government regulation to prevent what were seen as abuses that might occur in the private sector towards monopoly and concentration. And in fact, that became sort of a model for part of neoliberalism in the 1940s and 50s, particularly also advocated by people out of the University of Chicago of the 1930s. Most prominently, an economist named Henry Simons, who wrote a famous essay, A Positive Program for Laissez-Faire. Though, to be honest, as another prominent free market economist said decades later, named Leland Yeager, when he first read Simons' essay, he found a lot of a positive program, but not much laissez-faire. And Frank Knight, who was a very prominent University of Chicago economist, internationally renowned for his work on profit, interest, and investment and entrepreneurship, believed that this was the model that had to be followed. And you see the term neoliberal used in this sort of a way into the early 1950s by, for example, Milton Friedman, who was beginning to gain recognition and stature in the economics profession at the time. You occasionally see the term used even by Friedrich Hayek. But with the growth of the welfare state and the interventionist state, to be honest, most market-based economists gave up the use of the term neoliberalism. In the American context, okay, different from the European one, they often would call themselves conservative free market economists, which in America meant a much more constitutionally limited government, a wide range of competitive free enterprise, and at the minimalist floor of welfare to just support the most at risk, as they would say. Or there was a reawakening of the term of classical liberalism, harking back to the 19th century, or libertarian. And as a consequence of this, the word neoliberal fell out of use among proponents of the free market in this either laissez-faire sense or limited and restricted regulatory and welfare state sense. If I can use one example, I don't mean to press this question too long, I know to go on. One of the most prominent advocates of a limited third way was the very well-known German free market economist Wilhelm Röpke, often considered one of the intellectual fathers of the post-war German miracle, whose books against collectivism and in defense of a free economy, which he was writing in neutral Switzerland during the war, were being smuggled into Nazi Germany and being read by many of the economists who helped inspire the revival of a relatively free market economy in Germany under the term the social market economy. By the 1950s, people like Röpke, who was saying, well, there has to be a minimal third way, some welfare, a little bit of regulation to prevent concentration of industry if it was a problem. Even he was now saying that the welfare state and the interventionist state was out of control. And he didn't want to give up the idea of these minimalist roles of the government beyond life, liberty, and property. But the idea of a neoliberal identity with interventionism and welfare statism had fallen out of practice, even with its proponents for the most part. So you just had people calling themselves, in the American sense, conservative free marketeers, or classical liberal advocates of the free society, or libertarian. Now, what happened is that beginning in the 1980s and accelerating in the 1990s, the term neoliberal becomes renewed in fashion, but not by any of its earlier proponents or their students, but by critics of the free market. Now they say that neoliberalism was the attempt by advocates of capitalism, advocates of free enterprise, opponents of progressive policies and enlightened social democracy, from moving their societies further leftward, and that they're the ones who designed and inspired the post-war institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the policies of central banks of being anti-inflation and not wanting to finance deficits beyond some very minimal points when certain recessionary conditions existed. They basically were the apologists, the intellectual apologists, and the institutional creators of the bulwarks of post-war capitalism to hold back the onrush of a social democracy for the masses who needed, deserved, and rightly should have some form of socialism. One prominent voice, if I can just use an example, nowadays is an historian, an economics historian, but an economic historian, an historian of ideas named Quinn Slobodan. In 2019, he came out with a book called The Globalists. And he's the one who builds up this model, this interpretive framework, and he has many complementary figures who have been writing on this since, like I said, the 1990s. That people like Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Wilhelm Röpke and a whole swath of others, they're the apologists for capitalism to oppress the masses, to keep people in states of inequality, and that neoliberalism is the worst of capitalism. Neoliberalism is the society of today, in meaning they define our society as free market capitalism. And if you and I say, but where is the free market of capitalism with the degrees of government regulation, the government interventionism, the degree of government redistribution? Oh, that's just bones to the masses to hide the fact that everything exists so the wealthy capitalists can maintain their exploitation and oppression and wealth inequality among these bumbling masses. So today, the term neoliberalism is not the idea of, well, a reform of the old classical liberalism, but basically it's a pejorative term of condemning the existing institutional order of any free markets, any degrees of restraint on government, on interventionism and wealth redistribution, and implicitly an economic nationalism, because they view that neoliberalism is a global system. If any of the viewers have read some of this literature about Marxism in the late 19th and early 20th century, people like Lenin would say that imperialism is the last stage of capitalism. We're now not able to exploit workers within their national boundaries. There's the global system of imperial colonialism to enslave the world, to serve the handful of the ruling capitalist class. Well, people like Quinn Slobodan and these others, that's what they say without quoting Lenin or direct footnote references to Marx. But neoliberalism is the global system of capitalist oppression and exploitation of the masses, with the implication that the only way to free people and to establish a free society is to eliminate any vestige of limits on government, on any competitive free enterprise, and to prevent global investments by corporations. So it's also a form of economic nationalism. So national democracy can have national planning and redistribution of wealth to hold off the global exploiters. Okay, that's the dilemma we face today, where neoliberalism has nothing to do with laissez-faire. It's basically a condemning of a system that is very far from free market capitalism, in my view, in the view of some. And it's basically a way to make a twisted interpretive case that what we suffer from is laissez-faire today, and the only solution is some radical socialist democracy.
Do you think, because when it came out in the 80s, well, and then 90s, it could be something against mainly Thatcher and Reagan, because in a way, the system we had, the post-war system we had, like collapsed. Even Mitterrand had to do some privatizations in France because the system was broken, and they sort of mended it, not perfectly, but they mended it. And I thought was like a movement against that, but it's actually against that and also the social state. So it's basically, I could say it's against reality. It's a bit like reinventing capitalism, because in my view, capitalism for Marx was like a word that described reality. He had a model, a perfect model, and then there was this reality that he wanted to compare with. So he said, this reality is also a model. So these guys are sort of doing the same thing. Do you think it's something like that? Because they're not only against free market, let's call it radicals, they're also against the social democracy system, where there isn't a free market, but as you said, all these guys that came after the post-war dream was like a social market system. They're also against that. So actually, they're against reality in a way.
Yes. By the way, talking about Hayek, here is Friedrich Hayek. This is Fritzy. This is Fritzy, our standard poodle, but we call him Fritzy because it is short for Friedrich Hayek. So, and he passed away several years ago, but we also had Ludwig von Mises. I offered, we now have a new little dog, and I suggested Eugen for Eugen von Bumbaverk, but my wife drew the line at Eugen. She won't accept that. So
Carl Menger, maybe Carl.
So instead, he's Duke, but that stands for Duke Ellington. And so we have a 3-month-old puppy that someday will have his own jazz band, Duke Ellington. But anyway, I had to do that. I apologize. But I assume most of your viewers and listeners like dogs, right? Who doesn't like a dog?
Who doesn't?
I mean, even Hitler liked this dog. Of course, he poisoned his dog. But
More than people.
But you can say that there was this huge opposition to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but if you look at that period, the idea that they brought about this renaissance of unrestricted capitalism is factually, talking about reality, is not true. I lived during the Reagan era here in the United States. I loved his rhetoric. If you listen to his speeches and his rhetoric, it has an eloquent tone of government is the problem, not the solution. That the dignity of the individual, the importance of free enterprise, limiting government, getting it under control, so human creativity is set free through competition. But the fact is that if you look at the record of Reagan's 8 years in office in the 1980s, except for one or two minor little bureaus in the government, not one government department, bureau, agency was reduced, let alone abolished. And government spending rose during his years, and the budget deficits increased. Yes, he undertook a series of tax reforms called supply-side economics, lowering marginal tax rates to create an incentive for work, saving, and investment. And they did work. Tax revenues from a growing economy went up. But the problem is spending grew even more than the increase in government revenues due to that positive growth fiscal policy. So that the deficit gap kept getting bigger. And in many ways, this was the same thing with Margaret Thatcher. Yes, she attempted to privatize a lot of government housing. She tried to rein in some of the government-owned industries and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, these were strong voices of a rhetoric for a more limited government liberalism. But when their terms ended, respectively, as president or prime minister, government had not really decreased or diminished its overall role in society. But their rhetoric drove the people on the left crazy. It drove them crazy and created this catalyst for them to be aroused that we have to stop this capitalist revolution that Reagan and Thatcher are talking about. And I say, I greatly admired Reagan's rhetoric. He gave free enterprise ideas a podium of the presidency of the United States that type of rhetoric hadn't had for a very long time in America. But on the ground, in terms of policy, it was more rhetoric than reality. But that I lived through that, and I can assure you that drove the left crazy. They impugned him. He liked to hand out jelly beans.
And he had great Russian
jokes. He would
jokes.
say that his brain was full of jelly beans.
Yeah, and he had great Russian jokes, right?
Oh, actually, my wife met him. My wife is Russian, and Reagan came to Moscow, and she actually shook his hand, and she almost got into trouble because she went up to him and said, "Thank you for calling my country the evil empire." And so, according to her, Reagan turned to the Soviet security agents, obviously KGB, and said, "This is a nice young lady. Don't do anything to her." And I used to teach at Hillsdale College in Michigan, a small free market private school. And back in the early 1990s, Margaret Thatcher came there. My wife met Margaret Thatcher, a delightful woman. But the fact is that they really didn't change much, and that was the dilemma. But it set the left off, and from their places in the ivory towers of academia, they have been nurturing and cultivating a new generation of both general students who go out into the real world of professions, occupations, and in academia itself, so that they've recreated themselves in even more radical forms. And so what they basically use the term neoliberalism for, to come back to that, is a pejorative term to cover everything that they hate in modern society. So as far as they're concerned, when they see government regulation and the welfare state, they think those are devices for the ruling capitalists to throw bones to the masses, and are as corrupt and is unconnected to their own socialist or progressive image as the older liberalism would be.
There is a thing I'd like to ask you regarding this point is, well, it stands as a fact that Thatcher, at least, I don't know Reagan's policies that well, Thatcher privatized a lot. And still in this country, in the UK, you have the consequences of that. You have the railways privatized, the water distribution, etc. But at the same time, starting with Thatcher and then reinforced in successive governments, including Labour governments, you have a significant increase of the power of those who control Whitehall, so the administrative, the bureaucratic side of the state, in which every detail of life, I don't think I'm overreacting, ends up being regulated, controlled by these people, with a nice little detail that what used to be the powers of the local councils, etc., even house planning started moving towards Whitehall, education, etc. All this to ask you, because there is it, this is kind of a contradiction. On the one hand, you do this, but on the other hand, so what I'm trying to say is it's much more than increasing government spending, be it military spending or whatever, because you could do that without increasing the power of the bureaucratic side of the state. So is it that these people add some view, some belief that at least the state could be enlightened somehow, that knowledge could be concentrated there? So a market narrative for some parts of the society, but a strong belief in the power of centralization.
Yeah, maybe some of the people who watch this, particularly if they live in Great Britain or the United States, remember an excellent television show, British television show, called Yes Minister.
In which Whitehall
was 1970s or 80s, I forget when it originally.
I was thinking about Sir Humphrey when Jose was talking.
Yeah.
And so you have this guy who's appointed to the British cabinet, who's kind of a nothing, but he supported the prime minister in the last elections. And, Tolkien put him into office. But what you see watching him is the permanent bureaucracy behind him, who run the department for which he is in charge. They have a life of their own. They have a self-interest of their own. They have an agenda of their own. Maintain power, do not challenge the status quo, increase their authority and their legitimacy at every turn. In the United States, it's called what has been called the deep state. The idea that there is this network of both bureaucracies in the American government, especially though not only at the federal level, that is the national level at Washington, D.C., and a network of private sector special interest groups who live at the feeding trough of the government contracts, government subsidies, regulations that benefit them and limit undesired competition, and so on. And that even if someone gets elected who wants to bring about change, even if a part of the electorate, that is the voting public, were sympathetic to these changes, the difficulty of making that reality, because you have a civil service that basically can't be gotten rid of. They have employment for life. Unless they take a bribe or run around the government office naked, and even the latter one may not matter anymore. I'm so bad for even saying that. But certainly, crassly, bribe taking. You can't get rid of these bureaucrats. You might shuffle them between departments, but you can't get rid of them. So it is a permanent vested interest in the government controlling centralized structure itself. It's an element of what in economics, the field of public choice theory have emphasized. The iron triangle of politicians who want to get reelected and sell regulations and taxpayer money in exchange for campaign contributions and votes on election day. The bureaucracy, whose incentive is to maintain power and increase power and expand the financial base of their departments to justify and have the ability for promotions. And then the network of special interest groups who benefit from political profit making rather than market-based profit making. And that's an inertia of the institutional structure that would be difficult to bend or eliminate, even if, quote, some of the right-thinking people were elected to office and really wanted to do something. To a great extent, I think that was part of Reagan's problem. The people below him felt that he had to be controlled.
That's an interesting view, for sure. So it would be more a discussion on how power is exercised and maintained and replicated over time. It's more a question about that than about, strictly speaking, views on economics when it comes to these two people. So we could say that Reagan and Thatcher probably truly believed on what they were saying, but were controlled by these bureaucracies. That's what you're saying.
An example of this is that, not specifically, but how the handlers try to handle. When Ronald Reagan went to Berlin and made that famous remark in front of the Berlin Wall, obviously on the West Berlin side, Mr. Gorbachev, the then head of the Soviet Communist Party, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. He had written that into his speech, but then his advisors, in preparing the actual thing that he was to read in front of the Berlin Wall, took it out. And it was only because he liked that line and believed in it that he put it back in his speech in sort of just speaking off the cuff, in spite of what his advisors wanted. Oh, that's too controversial. Oh, that's going to make the Soviets unpleasant. That's rocking the boat. You know, there's political balances of the world geopolitical balances. I mean, so even those around Reagan in that type of thing tried to change his own speech so that he wouldn't be saying what he wanted to say. And then, so if that's the case, just with a damn speech against the Soviet Union standing in front of the Berlin Wall, imagine how it must have been on the day-to-day political policy matters that he would like to push in the White House. And of course, there's a Congress that he has to deal with, but the bureaucracy that is below him and in principle over which he's supposed to have directing control.
And then Gorbachev couldn't tear that wall down even if he wanted, because he had his own bureaucracy to worry about. And when he stepped out, they ousted him. So in the end, it just fell rotten, which is basically our best hope sometimes, right? Because if governments grow, if they want more, if they have the power and they get the means to have more and more and more, then eventually they collapse under their own weight. It's sort of our only hope. That's what happened in the Eastern European countries.
Yeah, this month, August, it's 30 years since the end of the Soviet Union. And what you're referring to is that in the middle of August 1991, the hardliners in the Soviet Communist Party and in the KGB who opposed Gorbachev's reforms, fearing that it was going to lead to an unraveling of the Soviet Union, undertook this hardline coup in Moscow for 3 days. I was there. I was in Moscow at that time with my future wife. You know, the images that maybe some remember of Boris Yeltsin, the head of the Russian Federation Soviet government, standing on a tank in front of the Russian Federation Parliament building, you know, rallying people to oppose the coup. My wife and I were there. We stood there for a good part of the 3 days facing army tanks and KGB units, wondering whether, what was going to happen. Now, luckily the coup failed, but it only failed because of the stagnant incompetency of the coup managers themselves. And the fact that there were several thousand. Remember, there's about 8 million people in Moscow. Only a few thousand were there with Yeltsin at the Russian Parliament building, but it was enough. And the cynicism of the system that the army units surrounding the Parliament building basically wouldn't obey orders to seize it, because it would have been a bloodbath, and I might very well not be doing this interview with you. But finally, the system implodes inside. But remember, it took 75 years for that implosion to occur in the Soviet Union. And it's estimated that the Soviet regime murdered, from Lenin through Stalin to his successors, possibly 64 million people in the building of the bright, beautiful socialist future. So a lot of bad things can happen before it becomes corrupt and stagnant and crumbling within for it to finally to implode.
Pedro, you had a question, I think.
It's hard to have something to say after this massive number of deaths of Soviet Union. But continuing, I remembered another episode, somewhat similar to that you referred from Reagan, is the one from Ludwig Erhard, when he decided to cut the price controls, and both bureaucrats, both sides of the bureaucrats were telling him not to do so, right?
Yes, in fact, he released the controls on a weekend when all of the British and American occupation administrators were not at their offices. And so, according to the story, a day or two later, Erhard, who had been put in charge of German economic affairs under the Allied occupation in Western Germany, was called into the office of Lucius Clay, the American senior commander of occupation forces. And Lucius Clay said to Ludwig Erhard, all of my advisors say that your freeing of prices and wages and regulations was going to lead to disaster. And Ludwig Erhard supposedly responded to Lucius Clay and said, General, don't worry, all of my advisors say the same. Well, of course, it freed the economy from all the restrictions. Prices could tell the truth. What was real supply and demand? Where were there unneeded commodities, and where was there a lack of commodities? And prices now being allowed to find their emerging supply and demand market levels created the motives and the incentives for people privately to respond to overcome both what had been the National Socialist planned economy and then the Allied occupation, forget about the Soviet zone, Allied occupation planned system of controls. And then shortly after that, Erhard introduced his monetary reform, eliminating the old inflated currency with a relatively non-inflationary new medium of exchange. So with monetary stability and the freeing of the economy, Germany soon became what has become known as the German miracle of accelerating and recovery from the war, even before the allied countries of France and Great Britain.
Yeah, can I just so in a sense, ironically, Erhard's policies were the original concept of neoliberalism. So one could say so, right? Or
in many ways, you're right, because what the reason they called it the social market economy, as I understand, I'm reading some of this older literature, is that they took the views of people like Wilhelm Röpke and others in Germany, Walter Eucken, who was a very prominent figure in this movement. Eucken was one of the Germans that was in Germany throughout the Hitler and war years without ever really compromising. He was very much of what we consider liberal in his thinking in many ways, if not all ways. But he, Eucken and Röpke, believed that we have to free the economy, competitive markets, competitive prices, profit opportunities, relatively low taxes to not create innovation and saving and investment disincentives, but that there has to be a certain amount of regulation of industry to prevent monopolization, and there has to be sort of what in English is called a safety net of minimal welfare for those who are most needy. But and that's they instituted this neoliberalism. But I should say that by the end of the 1950s, Repke was saying that it was now out of control, and that he was saying, what is the mark of a mature and successful society, where individuals and their families can be increasingly self-supporting without the need of that helping hand, as would have been the case a century earlier or very much earlier in the 20th century, and that the growth of the welfare state, what he would consider a perversion of the social market economy by those who didn't want to restrain it to a limited amount, what was creating what his colleague Alexander Rustov referred to in a lecture that he gave at the Montpellier Society in 1958, the other road to serfdom. It doesn't have to be totalitarian collectivism that's a road to serfdom. It can be welfare state paternalism, where increasing segments of the population become dependent upon government support and therefore cannot imagine life without such government dependency. That is another road of a passive population accepting control by their political masters.
Do you believe, do you believe, because, well, Germany had all these free market economies, but it also had, because we talked about civil servants before, had all these civil servants that had come from the Nazis,
yeah,
and from Imperial Germany, because the social state begins in Germany. If you get to 1938, well, Germany was probably the place in the world with the best or with the most proeminent social security system. They had sort of cared for Germans from birth to the grave, even because that was a way of saying we are the best race in the world. Do you believe that because you had all these bureaucrats in place, because after the war, of course, some went to jail, but most of them stayed where they were. So in the end, so you had this thing also working too fast, and you could not cope with it, and thus that neoliberalism is a bit fascist in a way.
Well, if I can sort of contextualize, just amplifying what you just said, the modern interventionist welfare state really first was developed in Imperial Germany under Bismarck in the 1870s, especially the 1880s and 1890s. Social security, that is government pensions, the national health system, the workplace regulations, and so forth. And the phrase in English, from the government takes care of you from the cradle to the grave, that was in Germany. And British people went to Germany, and a lot of Americans went to Germany to study at German universities in the 1880s and 1890s. And they came back from that and were deeply impressed by this. And in spite of, the Germans under the Kaiser goose-stepping around, wearing those stupid helmets with the point on top of it, they thought that you have these Americans writing these books before the First World War, that what Germany has is not something against freedom, but a new freedom, an enlightened freedom of people being taken care of from cradle to grave. And therefore, you're not losing freedom. There's a new freedom where government saves you from want and worry and concern, a guaranteed job, a guaranteed health care, a guaranteed retirement, a guaranteed everything. And in fact, in Britain's case, it was Lloyd George, who before the First World War went on a trip to Germany with one of his cabinet members, Winston Churchill, and came back from having seen this. And he was inspired then to begin the British legislation that became the national health system in Great Britain. So in Germany, you had this bureaucracy embedded both before and after the First World War. And so when the Nazis come in, and remember, it's the National Socialists, they're socialists too, just with a different variation of the common theme. And they reinforce the welfare state, government guaranteed pensions, government guaranteed health care, the wage and price controls, the planned economy is just an extension of the Bismarckian system. Now, it is true that this bureaucracy was still in place when the war ended, but but what some of the people have argued, an economist named Mansur Olson, passed away in the late 1990s, but he wrote a book in the 1980s, early 1990s, called The Rise and Decline of Nations. He was one of the prominent public choice theorists of that time. And he said, well, how do you break the spider's web of special interest groups, politicians, bureaucrats, and interest groups? And he said, basically, it happens through a collapse of the economy internally or war. And he argued that the reason why the Germans were able to institute the degree of a market-oriented economy that they did was the war shattered all the institutional structures. So that, in a sense, you had to partly build from the bottom up. The legitimacy of National Socialism was destroyed by the war. The legitimacy of government paternalism, always being right and bringing prosperity, obviously was shattered. When you're standing in the middle of Berlin and your entire city has been bombed to rubble, it's kind of hard to believe that, you know, the state has your benefit at heart and is going to assure it. So it was the destruction of the institutional glue that enabled these social market economists, the Earharts, the other people like Boom and others, who were able to bring about these changes. But not enough, because once you accept that the state has a role to regulate and redistribute wealth, you either bring in the old bureaucracy that had been doing it, or you introduce new members of that bureaucracy, and then they start developing a life of their own. The public choice theorists always emphasize you should analyze government as you analyze the market. And what is our starting premises? The system is based upon individuals, right? Society doesn't act, it's always the individual members of society. And there's no such thing as a black box called government. Government's made up of the individuals operating within the political structures. And each of them has their own interests, sometimes ideological goals and purposes, good or bad, but they're self-interests. And their self-interest is to see how can I use the system in conjunction to political trades with others to benefit myself. So once you carry over an old bureaucracy or you introduce a new one, it's very difficult to break. And that just created all of the problems that then Wilhelm Röpke and people like him became frustrated about when it seemed that their ideal system was being partly instituted earlier in the late 40s and early 50s.
And at that time, when people were thinking about these social security, social welfare state, etc., social security networks, the levels of that were not as high as they are today. Yeah. Do you think, in a rather, well, a bit stupid, but just for the purposes of a discussion with our audience, do you think that can play the role that the war played in Germany, as you were describing? Is it possible that the system comes down because that is overwhelming when we think of the US, of Portugal, the two countries in this debate? And what role is modern monetary theory playing in this debate?
Well, suppose that several years ago, when Greece was facing its very serious budgetary and fiscal problems, there had not been a World Bank and an IMF and a network of EU other countries and the euro, that if those had not been there to basically bail out Greece, and Greece was operating on its own and found itself bankrupt and unable to pay its debts and unable to support its existing welfare state obligations to its own citizens, the system would have imploded. But the problem is that even if it implodes, what then takes its place? And that gets us back to ideas. You know, Hayek in his essay, you know, The Intellectuals and Socialism, argued that if one set of ideas has to be able to respond to another set of ideas. And the importance of classical liberal free market ideas is that if you believe that this is the seeming inevitability of the dynamics of an interventionist and welfare state, the motives and the incentives are to spend more, tax more, distort and imbalance more, cause inflationary problems as central banks are turned to finance the budget deficits that can no longer be covered by either personal or corporate taxes. If you believe that that is sort of a trend that may very well lead to an economic and social catastrophe, well, what replaces it? Well, before that happens, you need to have an intellectual revolution of people being able to say, why did we get into this dilemma? What has caused it? It was these government policies with these ideological presumptions and these perverse incentives because of the welfare state and interventionist institutions that were set up that created the dynamics of these perverse dynamics. What we need to face the reality that there is no utopia from political paternalism, and that we need to return to, and in fact have something better, of a society of limited government, private property, free markets, impartial rule of law, and monetary restraint with some type of a monetary system that is not easily manipulated and controlled by those in political authority to print the money they want to undertake the spending they desire to undertake. Unless that intellectual revolution occurs, it could collapse, and then you have like these critics of neoliberalism who say, "You see, this is capitalism. We need even more socialism." That's the Bernie Sanders of America, right? Who ran for the presidency in the Democratic primaries last year against Joe Biden. I mean, and of course, all of Bernie Sanders' policy seems to be being implemented under Joe Biden, but that's a different matter. I mean, what is a quote Democratic socialist say? We're suffering from too much capitalism. It's not that there's too much government. We have too much capitalism. And so if they're the only man standing intellectually and ideologically, well, then they're going to say, well, then we really have to nationalize everything. We have to have central planning for everything. We have to tax even more to have a financial and social egalitarianism. So the battle of ideas are crucial that they proceed and that we succeed before some crisis of the system. Otherwise, they win it by default again.
So a battle of ideas, but at the same time, I believe part of the fault of liberalism sort of disappearing against totalitarianisms and collectivisms was because we believe people were rational to a point where you could have arguments. So it is also probably a moral battle, meaning the early liberals had some morality about how society should work, and it wasn't all rational. And do you think that maybe we lost that battle? Because we can say free market, the division of labor, the sound money, no deficits. Socialism doesn't work because it doesn't have prices. But then we lose the moral ground when they say, yeah, but we are nicer people, which they are not, because they breed monsters in the end, because they build a system that is so powerful that attracts the worst people. But shouldn't we also do a moral standing on liberalism? Because sometimes that doesn't exist, or at least they attack us and say they are immoral people. Liberals are immoral people because all they defend is the market mechanism, which is not a mechanism, it's a process, it's an institution, whatever. It works because there's people. But don't you think being rational, do you think being rational is enough, or do you think we should also be moral about these issues?
This is one of the most controversial issues among advocates of freedom. Let me put it in the following context, because I happen to agree with you. The reason why liberty triumphed in the 19th century, in my opinion, is because the advocates of liberty in the 18th century, the 1700s, made a moral case for freedom and the free society. in particularly the British and what became more or less the Western tradition at that time, the idea of natural rights. Now, natural rights are challenged by philosophers. It says it has no philosophical grounding. How do you prove natural rights? But it's nonetheless the case that when people like John Locke said that by God and by our reason, we can say that every human being has a certain determinate and discoverable nature. And if we say that a human being has a certain nature, we must then ask what is necessary for his survival and his betterment and prosperity. And if we say that this is the elements of his nature and what is necessary for his well-being and his prosperity, then what is the social setting in the context of which each individual can be viewed as having his right to his life, his right to his liberty, his right to that which is his honestly acquired fruits of his own labor. And it was that moral case that each individual has these inherent rights as a human being. Partly religious, the idea that each man made in the eyes of God and given his freedom by God in the ultimate sense of picking salvation or not. But the rational part of it, do people have a certain nature? Do their minds work a certain way? Is a certain way of human living essential? If men are to be free and prosperous, had great power. It brought about the revolutions. Let me use some examples. Slavery is one of the oldest institutions in human history, all of recorded history. The ancient Greeks had slaves, the ancient Romans had slaves, the ancient Chinese had slaves, the African tribes had slaves, the Aztecs and the Incas in the Americas before Columbus had slaves, and had human sacrifices. Slavery is one of the oldest institutions. Even Aristotle said, some men are naturally meant to be free, others possibly slaves. I mean, who's going to challenge this? But in the middle of the 18th century, the 1700s, these ideas worked on people and said, if men have these rights as a human being, given by God and in his nature, how can we say that it is right for one man to own another, to control another, to make him a mere implement in his hand, like holding a hammer, as opposed to a free will, self-governing individual who should be considered inviolable in these basic rights? It was that moral case that brought about the Anti-Slavery League in Great Britain, the anti-slave movement that brought about the end of slavery in the British Empire by an act of the Parliament in 1833 that resulted in the abolitionist movement in the United States, which only succeeded tragically through the American Civil War, which caused hundreds of thousands of deaths in the 1860s. But by the end of the 19th century, formally slavery basically had ended around the world. Now, de facto, some places still not, but particularly because of the European empires, and they could extend the rules to their empires. Virtually everywhere in the world, slavery ended as a formal, accepted, moral, legal institution. It was gone in 100 years after thousands of years of slavery. And that was because of the moral power of an idea. Each individual has an inherent right to his own life and liberty, which no man may take away without being in violation of nature and God. That's powerful. That is powerful. The idea of self-governing of a society. If men have a right to live their own life, should they not have the right to determine who their administrators, who their rulers will be for a set period of time within a constitutional set of rules as to what they may and may not do, as opposed to being ruled by an absolute king or a tyrant over whom they have no power to limit what they do to those in the society. The case for civil liberties, the case for economic freedom. If a man should have a freedom of conscience, should he not be able to also pick his own profession, his own occupation, to freely associate with those with whom he finds mutual gains from trade? And unfortunately, the most unsuccessful of these classic liberal crusades of the 19th century, to try to end war. War is brutal. It destroys life. It destroys the creations that men have worked centuries to make. We must control war through arbitration, through treaties concerning the the protection of civilians, prisoners of war, the methods of warfare. Because when wars end, aren't we supposed to be at peace again and associating and trading with each other once more? All of this was due from the beginning of the moral case for the right of the individual to be a free person, to be unmolested by others, and that government exists only to protect those rights. All of this is now out of favor, including on part by many libertarians, unfortunately. There'd be a whole story as to why. But unless we establish a new moral case for liberty in some way, shape, or form, I don't know how we can win. I often say, do you expect someone to bare their chest at the barricades when the argument is made to lower a trade tariff by 10%? No. A person bares their chest at the barricade for some fundamental and crucial principles of morality and liberty. And unless we can restore those, as well as making all these important economic arguments as to why government intervention, regulation, and planning does not work, I fear that we cannot succeed. Precisely because the left, the collectivists, have this high moral ground of the people, the collective, the good of the whole. There is no whole. The whole does not exist independent of individuals. And unless we understand and respect the dignity and the liberty and the uniqueness of the individual, there is no free and prosperous society. And I apologize. I've gotten into a pulpit to give a sermon. And I apologize.
No, it's good.
That's sort of what I wanted to hear.
We are all in full agreement, I would say.
Can I
Especially
ask,
with that final battle of law that is still not won. Pedro.
so can I ask two more questions? Perhaps the final questions. I don't know if you have others.
No. Yeah. Yes. No. You can.
The first one, returning a little bit to the origins of the term neoliberal, as you have well explained. Neoliberalism in the original sense of the 30s was far from being an extremist laissez-faire proposition, was instead a movement to find a new kind of laissez-faire that would be more adjusted to what the people were asking for at that time, in a sense. So my question is related to John Maynard Keynes, and in what sense, let's put the general theory aside, but reading his essays on persuasion and his discussions he actually discussed whether he was himself a liberal or not. It seems to me that if Keynes had not such a huge ego, perhaps he could be one of the members of that Lookman Colloquium, no?
I understand what you're saying. Okay, in that famous essay that you're referring to, which is reprinted in his essays on persuasion, Keynes asks himself, I think it's even the title of the essay, am I a liberal? And he says, I'm not a conservative, because conservatives stand for nothing. They're just sort of knuckleheads. No principles, just sort of whatever it is that serves them. Just tradition and custom without thinking. I'm not a socialist, he says, or a communist. And he had traveled to the Soviet Union. Because I believe too much in civil liberties and a certain autonomy of the individual. And it's interesting, he also says there, and referring to the labor movement in Britain, the Labour Party is not my class. Notice how he puts that. It's not my class. And he considered that the Labour Party wasn't filled with very many intelligent people either. So therefore he considers himself liberal, but what kind of a liberal? He says, if you mean by laissez-faire liberalism, no. What he believes is an enlightened, a caring, an empathetic liberalism that believes in an activist and a state that provides welfare, that regulates, directs within corridors the remainder of the free economy. It's worth remembering that he gave a lecture in the 1920s as well in Berlin on the end of laissez-faire. And he basically endorses that Bismarckian German welfare state. And I also should mention that in that essay, he also says if we're going to plan the society in these benevolent welfare statist ways, maybe we need to plan people as well. He did have affiliations with the British Eugenics Society, which of course, you know, I guess he should be culturally canceled, to use that phrase that is in America now. You know. And any building with Keynes's name should be changed, you know, I guess. But I think that even by that standard, Keynes would not fit in the model of the thinking of the people who met in Paris for that Walter Lookman colloquium. They were still too connected to the market than he would have been willing to feel comfortable with.
He was actually a liberal on the old sense of the word before the revolution, which was a aristocratic disposition to generosity.
Yeah.
That was his type of liberalism, where the word, I don't know if you saw, there's a book from last year, I think it was from Rosenblatt, who's a Swedish teacher at Princeton, I think, and she went to discover what the word meant throughout the ages. And before the revolution, and actually when the revolutionaries are talking about liberal constitutions, it's because they're actually discussing if the American or the British constitutions are more liberal, because liberal was still like a disposition of generosity from the prince, from the king. So in a way, Keynes is that type of an old liberal, very old liberal, I'd say.
Ancient.
He was a liberal who believed in paternalism. He believed that the state had this benevolent role.
We're saying that we need to put an end. Time has flown quite rapidly. Thank you so much, Richard, for your time and for your comments.
My absolute pleasure to have participated in this. I was delighted that you invited me to have this conversation. As you saw, I have Friedrich Hayek living in my house, and Friedrich Hayek needs to take me for a walk.
No, that's good.
And,
I'm sure
my delight and pleasure to have this conversation.
I'm sure it will be a very important conversation to share with our colleagues in Portugal. And well, thank you so much, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
With pleasure.
Thank you.